the very foundations of modern society. I mean, our institutions, our universities, even our corporate cultures. What if they're all just operating on a manufactured illusion?
Right, a complete mirage.
Exactly. Like, what if the system that runs the modern world actively demands that you, the listener, deny basic human biology and ignore the evidence of your own eyes just to participate in it?
That's a huge question.
It really is. And we are pulling apart a stack of incredibly provocative source material today to answer it. We are diving into a new, heavily polarizing, and intensely debated ebook called the Gynocentric Mirage, exposing the evolutionary dead end of the feminine consensus. And that's by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, and it's quite the read.
It's an absolute masterclass in uncovering the historical architecture of our institutions. Riker essentially takes you on this deep, methodical journey, starting way back with the foundational philosophy of Aristotle.
Right, going all the way back to the ancients.
Yeah, and then he moves through the intellectual shifts of the Enlightenment, and he maps out this highly specific blueprint of how, in his view, all these structural pillars were just systematically dismantled by cultural Marxism and modern feminist ideology.
He definitely doesn't pull any punches.
No, he doesn't. So if you're a man seeking to understand the foundational arguments of the manosphere or men's rights activism, or if you just want to understand the historical reality of patriarchal systems before they were supposedly captured, this deep dive is absolutely essential listening.
For sure.
But hey, before we even begin mapping this out, do us a huge favor. Like and subscribe to the show right now so we can keep bringing you these deep dives. And if you want to follow along with the source text as we analyze it today, I highly urge you to go buy the ebook right now.
Yeah, you can grab it on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
Exactly. And make sure you follow the author for his uncensored analysis on Substack at Conrad Riker.
So before we jump into the weeds here, we do have a very specific mission today, and it requires a crucial disclaimer for you, the listener.
Right. Very important.
This book contains highly charged political, social, and cultural commentary. Our goal today is not to endorse or take sides on these viewpoints.
Not at all.
Right. Our mission is just to impartially report on the contents of the text. We're mapping out Riker's worldview to help you understand the exact arguments, the historical data points he leverages, and, the philosophical frameworks contained in the original source material.
Exactly. We're just the messengers here. So let's get into it. Riker's foundational claim is that modern society is an illusion. It's a facade draped over reality. But to understand why he thinks the house is built on sand, we really have to look at what he considers the bedrock.
Right, where he starts building his case.
And he doesn't start with modern politics at all. He starts with classical philosophy. Specifically, he roots his entire biological argument in the ancient Greek concept of telos.
Yeah, tell us.
So for the listener who hasn't sat in a philosophy seminar recently, how exactly is Riker weaponizing Aristotle to explain evolutionary biology?
Well, Riker uses Aristotle to establish an objective, non-negotiable reality. So telos roughly translates to ultimate purpose, or inherent designed function.
Okay.
And Riker uses this analogy of a knife, which is really helpful. The telos of a knife is the act of cutting. A blacksmith forged it, they tempered the steel, they honed the edge for that singular function.
Right, it's made to do one specific thing.
Exactly. So if you take that knife and you try to use it as a spoon to hold soup, you aren't just being inefficient, you're actually denying the object's fundamental nature.
You're ignoring reality.
Yeah. And Riker takes this philosophical concept and overlays it right onto millions of years of human evolutionary biology.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He argues that human biology, which was forged by the brutal, unforgiving pressures of prehistoric survival, also possesses a rigid telos.
So he's saying we have an ultimate purpose built into our DNA.
Yes, the text posits that men and women have distinct biologically dimorphic roles that were optimized purely for the survival of the species.
And what does he define as the masculine telos?
According to his framework, it revolves around outward system building, physical protection, the extraction of resources from really dangerous environments, and logical order.
Okay, so building the world and defending it.
Right. And the modern societal illusion, Riker argues, is the mandated belief that these hardwired evolutionary realities are just interchangeable costumes.
Ah, I see. And he traces the genesis of this illusion, this idea that biology is just a costume you can take off back to the 17th century, right? He targets John Locke's concept of the tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
Yeah, the blank slate. But Locke was an Enlightenment thinker. He was trying to explain how humans acquire knowledge, basically arguing we aren't born with innate ideas.
Right, it was an epistemological theory.
Exactly. So how does Riker connect a theory about how we learn math from the 1600s to modern gender ideology?
Well, Riker argues that the concept underwent a catastrophic mutation.
Catastrophic mutation.
Yeah, Locke originally meant that a human mind is a blank slate regarding intellectual knowledge. Like you said, you have to learn mathematics. You aren't born knowing calculus.
Right, obviously.
But Riker asserts that Marxist sociologists and later modern leftists hijacked this framework, and they aggressively expanded it into the realm of biology.
So they took it from the mind and applied it to the body.
Exactly. They morphed the blank slate into a tool to claim that gender, behavior, and psychological predispositions are entirely social constructs.
Oh, so in this hijacked version, we're all just formless clay.
Right. In this theory, humans are born identical, and any observable differences in career choices, aggression levels, or familial roles between men and women are solely the result of oppressive societal conditioning.
So it's all just programming.
That's the claim he's critiquing. Riker outright rejects this. He calls it a biological fallacy that requires society to basically function in a state of mass psychosis.
Mass psychosis, that's a strong phrase. But he doesn't just reject it philosophically, right? He actually brings in empirical data to back this up.
He does.
He points to this massive sociological test case where society literally tried to forcefully apply the blank slate theory, the Israeli kibbutz experiment.
Yeah, the 1979 study by sociologist Lionel Tiger. This is completely central to Riker's empirical defense.
Break that down for us. What were these kibbutzim?
Israeli kibbutzim were essentially highly intentional, egalitarian, agricultural communes.
Okay.
The architects of these communities applied intense, systemic ideological conditioning to completely eradicate traditional gender roles.
So they were actively trying to prove the blank slate.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a suggestion, it was the structural rule of the commune. Men and women were assigned identical labor.
Wow, identical labor.
Yeah. Childcare was completely communalized to free women from the domestic sphere, and everyone was supposed to participate equally in every single facet of survival.
It sounds like the ultimate test of that utopian idea.
It was the ultimate test of the blank slate utopia.
But the communal structure couldn't hold back the biological tide, according to Riker.
Not at all. Despite immense structural social pressure to maintain this egalitarian parity, the experiment just organically fractured along biological lines.
Wait, so it just fell apart on its own?
Basically, yeah. The data showed that men and women naturally and consistently reverted to traditional roles.
What did that look like in practice?
Well, the men inevitably drifted toward the heavy, hazardous agricultural labor. The construction of infrastructure and the armed defense of the perimeter.
The dangerous stuff?
Right. And the women, despite being structurally freed from domestic expectations, they organically gravitated toward childcare, early education, and the internal logistical duties of the commune.
That is fascinating. So Riker uses this historical data point to state that the telos always asserts itself.
Always. The moment the gynocentric mirage is subjected to the brutal friction of physical reality and survival, the illusion evaporates, and biology just takes the wheel.
Okay, but that brings up a huge point. If the biological drive is that undeniable, if it always wins out in the end, how does the left maintain the narrative that society is an oppressive patriarchal conspiracy?
Well, Riker introduces a mechanical explanation for this. He calls it the apex fallacy.
The apex fallacy. Yeah, it reminds me of looking at the foundation of a massive skyscraper.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, like if you stand on the street, you see the penthouses, the glass, the luxury, basically the very top fraction of the building. And if you have the apex fallacy, you declare the entire structure is made of luxury glass, completely ignoring the thousands of tons of dark, crushing subterranean concrete and steel buried in the dirt just to hold those penthouses up in the sky.
The skyscraper analogy captures the mechanics of the bias perfectly. The apex fallacy is a cognitive blind spot, and Riker argues it is deliberately maintained by the left.
Deliberately? How so?
When left-leaning sociologists and activists look at society, they exclusively look at the top 1% of men.
The penthouses.
Exactly. The billionaire CEOs, the heads of state, the elite power brokers. And they use that glittering apex to characterize the entire male experience as inherently privileged and oppressive.
Wow.
But mathematically speaking, that ignores the vast, overwhelming majority of the male population.
The concrete foundation buried in the dirt.
Precisely. The bottom 99% of men. Riker writes extensively about the men doing the brutal, invisible, and highly dangerous labor required to maintain the physical infrastructure of civilization.
What kind of jobs is he talking about here?
He lists things like deep earth loggers, underwater structural welders, sanitation workers who are waist deep in subterranean sewer systems, linemen maintaining high voltage electrical grids in freezing
The
storms.
guys keeping everything running.
Right. Society completely relies on these men to carry the heaviest, most life-destroying burdens just to keep the lights on and the water clean.
And yet,
Yet, Riker argues, the culture actively demonizes them. He frames history not as a grand conspiracy of men colluding to oppress women, but as a continuous cycle of men sacrificing their bodies and lives in brutal labor to protect, provide, and build.
but that begs a massive structural question. If men are literally doing the hazardous labor, keeping the civilization from collapsing into a dark age, how does Riker explain society's collective blind spot to male disposability?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, how did the culture become so hostile to the very demographic keeping it alive?
Riker traces this hostility directly to a calculated, historical ideological shift. To understand how the illusion took root, he maps the timeline back to the Frankfurt School.
The Frankfurt School. Okay, let's dig into that.
We're talking about thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. These were Marxist theorists who fled Europe in the 1930s and integrated themselves into Columbia University.
Right, but classical Marxism was built on the idea of an economic revolution, wasn't it? The proletariat workers rising up against the factory owners.
Exactly.
But in America in the 1930s and 40s, that wasn't working. The working class American man was buying a house, getting a car, building a family. He didn't want an economic revolution because capitalism was actually working for him.
And that prosperity of the Western working class man was the exact obstacle the Frankfurt School faced. Since they couldn't incite a classic economic uprising, Riker argues they executed a mechanical shift in strategy.
What did they do?
They pivoted from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you can't overthrow the factory, you overthrow the family. They systematically targeted the fundamental cultural pillars of Western society.
So they just changed the battlefield.
Completely. Their academic output aimed to dismantle the traditional nuclear family structure, erode the concept of objective, empirical truth, and specifically subvert the authority of the male provider.
Because he was the foundation.
Right, because that provider was the bedrock of the capitalist stability they wanted to destroy.
That is wild. And Riker compares the modern culmination of this cultural engineering to the fall of the Roman Empire, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
But he doesn't just make a poetic comparison, he breaks down the mechanics of utopian equity versus reality.
The Roman Empire comparison is the structural core of his thesis regarding societal collapse. Rome didn't just fall because barbarians breached the gates. It fell because of internal decay.
Right, they rotted from the inside out.
Exactly. The Romans abandoned their strict pragmatism, their rigorous legal frameworks, and their civic virtue. In the late Empire, the ruling class placated a decaying society with bread and circuses,
Free food and gladiators.
free food and gladiatorial games, just to distract everyone from the crumbling infrastructure.
Yeah.
Riker looks at the modern push for absolute safety, trigger warnings, and what he calls TikTok and DEI policies.
DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right, he argues these are our modern bread and circuses.
How exactly does Riker define DEI in this context? Because it's an acronym thrown around constantly in the corporate world. But how does he view its actual mechanical function in an institution?
Riker views DEI not as a pursuit of fairness, but as an administrative mechanism designed to enforce utopian equity,
Utopian equity.
meaning the impossible promise of equal outcomes for everyone, completely regardless of individual merit, competence, or effort.
So forcing everyone to cross the finish line at the exact same time.
Yes. And he argues this administrative framework actively defies basic biology and Newtonian physics. When an institution prioritizes emotional comfort and identity quotas over logistical reality and raw competence, it inevitably degrades.
It has to.
Yeah. Riker posits that the closer a society gets to this mirage, the faster it exhausts its surplus resources, compromises its critical infrastructure, and mathematically guarantees its own collapse.
That makes a lot of sense. And Riker actually takes a swing at the underlying philosophy of this modern leftism using a formal logical trap, right? The reductio ad absurdum.
Oh yes, the logical trap.
He essentially tries to prove that their entire worldview eats itself.
He utilizes classical logic to dismantle subjective relativism. The modern academic left often operates on the premise that lived experience supersedes objective data, They posit that all truth is subjective.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right, so Riker springs a classic philosophical trap here. If an ideologue claims that all truth is subjective, that very statement is attempting to present itself as an objectively true fact.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Therefore, the foundational premise of modern leftism inherently refutes itself. If all truth is indeed subjective, then the statement, truth is subjective, is meaningless.
It's a paradox.
It is a fatal logical paradox. The ideology cannot mathematically sustain itself under basic scrutiny.
Okay, I understand the logical trap. It's airtight. But let me push back a little here.
Sure.
If this new cultural operating system is doomed by a paradox, if it fundamentally refutes itself, why has it been so incredibly successful at capturing our institutions? Like, how does a buggy, paradox-ridden software program manage to install itself on the mainframes of every major university and corporation?
Riker's answer to that is really chilling. He argues the system doesn't require logical consistency to spread. It operates entirely on psychological subjugation and the manufacturing of artificial guilt.
Artificial guilt.
Right. It bypassed the logical mainframe and directly attacked the psychological hardware of the individual man, which transitions us to his analysis of how modern institutions pathologize natural male behavior.
Oh man, the APA guidelines.
Yes. The text thoroughly dissects the 2019 American Psychological Association guidelines.
The APA guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. When I read his breakdown of this, it honestly felt like reading a dystopian novel.
It really does read like one. Riker views the 2019 APA release not as a genuine therapeutic or medical document, but as an ideologically captured manifesto.
What did they actually say in it?
In these guidelines, the APA essentially branded traditional masculinity, specifically traits like stoicism, competitiveness, and aggressiveness, as inherently harmful or toxic.
They just labeled normal male traits as toxic.
Exactly. Riker frames this as the ultimate defeat of Baconian empiricism.
Meaning Francis Bacon and the scientific method, right? The idea that we should objectively observe reality and gather data rather than starting with the dogma.
Correct. Instead of objectively observing natural male biology and analyzing its evolutionary utility, the fact that male competitiveness literally built the modern world, the psychological establishment started with a preconceived Marxist conclusion.
That traditional masculinity is a defective pathology that needs to be cured.
Yes, they took the exact traits that ensure survival and classified them as a mental health crisis.
That is deeply disturbing. And Riker points to actual CDC statistics to outline what he calls a silent crisis, right? And he frames these numbers not as an anomaly, but as mathematical proof of his thesis.
He leans heavily into the CDC suicide demographics. Riker cites that for every 100,000 men in the United States, roughly 23 will end their own lives,
23.
compared to about 6 women per 100,000.
That's almost 4 times higher.
It is. And he refuses to frame this purely as a mental health failure. Within his architectural analysis, these numbers are the exact predictable output of a culture that criminalizes male identity.
It's the result of the system working as intended, basically.
Exactly. Society structurally strips men of their Aristotelian telos. It still mercilessly demands that they provide absolute physical and economic utility, but simultaneously shames them for the aggressive and stoic traits that historically allowed them to shoulder those burdens.
They want the protection and the resources, but they hate the guy providing them.
That's the double bind.
And you see this psychological straitjacket enforced in real time in the corporate world. Riker goes aggressively after modern HR departments. He doesn't see them as administrative support. He sees them as ideological enforcers.
He absolutely does.
Yeah.
He views corporate America's integration of mandatory vulnerability circles, sensitivity training, and unconscious bias seminars as structural loyalty tests to the gynocentric consensus.
Loyalty tests.
Yeah. By forcing men into environments where they must performatively display emotional vulnerability and total compliance with subjective language codes, the corporate structure effectively neuters male ambition and dominance.
So what happens if a guy just doesn't play along?
Well, if a man chooses to sit quietly, internally regulate his emotions, and focus purely on objective output, which is just classical stoicism, the HR apparatus targets him.
He gets a target on his back.
Right. He is labeled uncooperative or a dangerous representative of toxic masculinity.
Okay, this presents a massive practical dilemma. Riker demands that his readers build what he calls a stoic firewall.
The firewall, yes.
He tells men to aggressively refuse to trauma dump, to stop participating in these vulnerability circles, and to stop vomiting their inner lives out for public validation.
Right.
But practically speaking, how does the modern man process the crushing psychological burdens of life, family, and a hostile state without some form of emotional outlet? Is Riker really demanding that men operate as emotionless androids just to spite the HR department?
No, and Riker explicitly clarifies this tension. He references Roman pragmatism heavily. He is absolutely not advocating for emotional suppression. He acknowledges that suppression leads to deep neuroticism and psychological fracture.
Okay, so what is the firewall then?
He is advocating for the dichotomy of control. That's a core concept from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Epictetus, who was actually a former slave, taught that you must rigorously separate what you can control from what you cannot.
To control your own reactions.
Right. You control your own logic, reactions, and immediate choices. And you accept that you cannot control the opinions of the mob, the state, or the HR bureaucracy.
So it's a tactical application, not a lack of feeling.
It is entirely tactical. Riker points to Marcus Aurelius writing his meditations while commanding legions amidst the blood and chaos of the Marcomannic Wars. Aurelius wasn't an android. He was managing profound stress.
Yeah, you don't run an empire by having no emotions.
Exactly. Stoic emotional regulation, in Riker's framework, is a shield against a psychological double-bind. When a corporate entity or media narrative tries to induce guilt-shaming your strength while simultaneously demanding you fix their infrastructure, you categorize that input.
You file it away.
You maintain your logical frame, you secure your immediate environment, and you utterly dismiss the emotional hysterics of what he refers to as ideologically possessed NPCs.
NPCs, wow.
You don't eliminate your feelings. You just refuse to allow hostile institutions to weaponize your feelings against you.
Man, that is powerful. Now, to understand how these corporate HR standards and these psychological double binds became the ubiquitous water we all swim in, Riker says we have to look upstream. We have to look at the factories producing the elite managerial class.
For the universities.
Yes, the universities.
Riker argues that the Western Academy has undergone a complete and devastating betrayal of reason. Historically, the university was a patriarchal forge operating on the Socratic method.
Right. Asking tough questions.
It was designed to be an unforgiving arena of rigorous, highly confrontational debate aimed at stripping away falsehoods to uncover objective truth.
And what is it now?
Today, he argues, the structural architecture has been inverted. The modern university functions as a gynocentric safe space where the highest priority is the emotional comfort of the student body.
Emotional comfort over truth.
Exactly. And any data or biological reality that causes emotional discomfort is just systematically censored.
Unbelievable. And Riker points to one specific, highly publicized historical event as the absolute zenith of this academic ideological possession. The 2006 Duke lacrosse case. Let's break down the mechanics of why this case is so central to his argument.
The 2006 Duke lacrosse case functions as Riker's primary case study for institutional decay. 3 white male Duke lacrosse players were accused of horrific crimes by an exotic dancer.
I remember this making national news.
It was everywhere. And almost immediately, before any forensic facts were established or investigations concluded, the university administration and the national media completely abandoned the fundamental Enlightenment principle of innocent until proven guilty.
They just threw it out the window.
Entirely. And Riker analyzes why they abandoned it so eagerly. The answer, he argues, is that the accusation perfectly aligned with the prevailing intersectional narrative.
Which is what?
Female victimhood entirely crushed under the weight of white male privilege.
So it fit the script. And he specifically targets a faculty letter known as the Group of 88, right?
Yes. The Group of 88 was a coalition of Duke professors who signed and published an advertisement in the student newspaper. It heavily condemned the accused students and highlighted the supposedly racist and sexist culture of the team.
Before any trial.
Exactly. And Riker dissects the gravity of this. These 88 individuals were supposedly the highly educated, rational guardians of Western academia. Yet they eagerly prioritized a sociological narrative over concrete, airtight DNA evidence and heavily corroborated alibis.
So they ignored the facts because the story felt right to them.
Right, and when the objective truth eventually surfaced, completely exonerating the 3 men and proving the entire accusation was fabricated.
Did they apologize?
Mostly no. The ideologues within the faculty largely refused to apologize or retract their ideological stances.
That is wild.
For Riker, the Duke case proved that narrative now structurally supersedes reality. Academia is no longer an institution of empirical truth. It operates as an orthodox church enforcing ideological possession.
He bolsters this claim by examining the academic peer review process itself. citing the grievance studies hoax. This proves that the system doesn't just passively accept bad logic, it actively rewards intellectual bankruptcy.
Oh, the grievance studies hoax is an incredible example. It was a massive sting operation conducted by 3 researchers. They deliberately wrote absurd, methodologically flawed, and intellectually bankrupt papers.
Absolute nonsense.
Yeah, but they used thick, feminist, and intersectional buzzwords. And they submitted these fake papers to highly respected, peer-reviewed academic journals in fields like sociology and gender studies.
And they got published.
Many of them did. The most damning example Riker highlights is when the researchers literally took a section of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Wait, Mein Kampf?
Yes. They rewrote it by swapping out the original text with intersectional academic jargon, and it was accepted and published.
You have got to be kidding me.
No. The academic establishment praised the work. Riker uses this mechanical failure to argue that the university system's peer review process now functions strictly on a consensus of who signals the correct political ideology.
It's completely disconnected from rigorous data or objective reality.
Entirely disconnected.
So if the university is, as Riker defines it, hostile territory operating as a Marxist indoctrination camp, what is the actionable advice for a young man listening to this today? If the whole system is rigged to pathologize his biology and extract his wealth, should he just abandon higher education entirely and skip college?
You'd think so, but Riker is remarkably pragmatic here. He doesn't issue a blanket mandate to skip college. Instead, he advises young men to navigate the university system like a soldier operating behind enemy lines.
Behind enemy lines, I like that.
He explicitly warns against taking on massive debt for grievance study degrees, things like sociology, modern literature, gender studies. He views those as pure ideological programming that provides zero market value.
So what should they study?
He instructs men to ruthlessly pursue rigorous, objective fields where physical reality and mathematics cannot be faked or altered by a committee vote.
Things like STEM.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Structural engineering, computer science, advanced mathematics, physics. Furthermore, he urges a return to classical self-education.
So reading on your own time.
He wants young men reading the great books of the Western canon independently. The goal is to build a parallel structure of classical rational education within your own mind so that the broader institutional gaslighting cannot penetrate your psychology.
Building the firewall with knowledge?
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered the psychological warfare, the corporate HR subjugation, and the academic capture. But Section 5 of this book shifts from ideological erasure to what Riker views as the most terrifying frontier of all.
This part is intense.
It really is. We are talking about the literal biological obsolescence of the male genome through genetic engineering.
Yeah. Riker frames this section through the lens of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
The classic dystopian novel.
Right. He focuses specifically on Huxley's concept of the world state and the Volkanovsky process. That's the industrial commodification of human reproduction in sterile laboratories.
Where babies are basically grown in vats.
Exactly. And Riker argues that Huxley wasn't writing science fiction, he was writing the operational schematic for the ultimate feminist endgame.
Wow.
The final goal of the Gynocentric Mirage isn't just to socially subjugate men. It is to create a sterile, commodified matriarchy where the male biological input is entirely unnecessary.
And he transitions from Huxley's fiction to actual scientific precedent to prove this, specifically the Kaguya mouse experiment from 2004.
Yeah, the parthenogenesis experiment.
How exactly does parthenogenesis work, and why does Riker view a lab experiment on rodents as an existential threat to men?
Well, parthenogenesis is a form of reproduction where an embryo develops without fertilization by a sperm cell. In 2004, Japanese scientists successfully manipulated the genetic material of 2 female mice to breed a viable offspring, named Kaguya.
So they achieved mammalian reproduction with 0 male genetic input.
0. Scientifically, it was a massive breakthrough in genetic manipulation. But Riker analyzes the sociological reaction to this event. He argues that the academic and media establishment didn't just view Kaguya as a biological curiosity.
They celebrated it.
They celebrated it as an ideological victory. He asserts that the cultural engineers salivate at the prospect of rendering the male genome mathematically obsolete. It would allow a bureaucratic system to entirely monopolize the reproductive process.
Oh, man. And he moves from these high-tech genetic frontiers back to the current everyday reality of sperm donation, which he writes about with absolute disgust. He calls it the commodification of paternity.
Yes.
He cites the case of Bertold Weisner. Who was that?
Bertold Weisner was a biologist who ran a fertility clinic in London. And he secretly used his own sperm to father an estimated 600 children.
600 kids from one guy.
Yeah. Riker uses this horrifying case to dismantle the modern framing of sperm donation. The culture currently frames sperm donation as a detached, altruistic medical service.
Right, helping families.
But Riker views it as a biopolitical weapon that completely strips men of their ancestral authority. By reducing the creation of human life to a sterile, transactional exchange, society hands total reproductive power to a corporate matriarchy.
He has a really visceral way of describing this, doesn't he?
He does. He views a man walking into a clinic and selling his biological essence, his evolutionary legacy, for a $50 transaction as an act of profound cosmic treason.
Cosmic treason. And Riker uses an incredible analogy here to explain the danger of this mass-produced genetic legacy, the Gros Michel banana.
Oh, this is one of the most mechanically sound biological analogies in the text.
Walk us through it.
So, up until the mid-20th century, the Gros Michel was the globally dominant banana variety. Everyone ate them. But because agricultural corporations prioritize yield over diversity, almost all Gros Michel bananas were genetic clones.
They lack genetic diversity.
Entirely. So when a single fungal pathogen Panama disease swept through the plantations, it encountered no genetic resistance and wiped the variety out almost entirely.
Just gone.
Right. And Riker argues that the commercialization of sperm banks, where a tiny fraction of anonymous donors sire thousands of children, drastically narrows the human male genetic pool.
Oh, I see.
He warns that this is creating a Gros Michel vulnerability in human DNA. By treating paternity as a mass-produced commodity, we are engineering monoculture fragility, setting the human species up for a catastrophic biological collapse when a novel pathogen inevitably hits.
Okay, I have to challenge Riker's framing here. He paints genetic engineering, CRISPR technology, and artificial reproduction as a targeted biopolitical weapon deployed specifically to erase men.
Right.
But isn't science simply progressing along its natural trajectory? I mean, the scientific method naturally seeks to understand and control biological processes, including decoupling reproduction from the physical act of sex. Is Riker essentially arguing that the Enlightenment's push for unfettered scientific discovery accidentally manufactured the very tools that will destroy it?
Riker is acutely aware of that exact paradox, and it's a tension he grapples with heavily in the book. Riker reveres the Enlightenment thinkers, Bacon, Newton, Locke, and their commitment to objective scientific discovery.
So he's not anti-science.
Not at all. However, he argues that a critical severance occurred when the raw power of the scientific method was decoupled from its foundational Judeo-Christian ethical framework.
Wait, what does that framework do?
Well, it's a framework that strictly valued natural law, the nuclear family, and ancestral lineage. And when science lost that anchor, it mutated. Without that ethical anchor, science ceased to be a tool for understanding reality and became a tool for the left to attempt to rewrite the fundamental source code of humanity.
Wow.
Riker fears that because the cultural engineers cannot successfully socially program the competitive, patriarchal spirit out of men, as proven by the kibbutz experiment, they will simply use CRISPR and genetic editing to physically sever the rebellion from our DNA entirely.
They can't train it out of us, so they'll just breed it out of us.
Exactly his point.
Okay, let's bring this massive analysis of institutional capture and genetic engineering back down to the granular domestic sphere, because all of these macro-level historical shifts profoundly alter the mechanics of how men and women interact today in the mating market, in marriage, and in the family courts.
Oh yeah, the family courts.
Riker views the modern legal landscape as structurally hostile to the male provider, and he pinpoints the exact date the architecture fractured. September 5, 1969.
Yes, he focuses intensely on the California Family Law Act.
Signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan.
Right. Reagan introduced the concept of no-fault divorce to the United States. Pragmatically, the intent was to stop spouses from committing perjury and fabricating evidence of adultery or abuse in order to dissolve messy marriages.
It was supposed to clean up the legal process.
But Riker performs a purely mechanical analysis of the outcome. He argues that no-fault divorce completely destroyed the contractual nature of marriage.
How exactly does this mechanism extract wealth, according to his framework?
Well, before 1969, marriage was a binding legal contract requiring a breach of terms like infidelity or abandonment to dissolve and trigger a division of assets.
You had to prove someone broke the rules.
Right. No-fault divorce allowed either party to unilaterally terminate the contract at any time for any subjective reason without having to prove any fault.
I'm not happy anymore, give me half.
Exactly. Riker argues this transformed marriage from a protected covenant into a state-sanctioned mechanism for resource extraction. The state now has the unilateral authority to step into a man's life, dismantle his family, restrict access to his children, and systemically extract his wealth and property.
Even if he didn't do anything wrong.
Even if he upheld every single obligation of the original marital contract.
That's brutal. And he moves from the financial extraction of the divorce courts to the physical and legal vulnerability men face under domestic violence frameworks. He focuses his critique heavily on the Duluth model developed in the 1980s.
The Duluth model.
What is the actual mechanism of the Duluth model, and why does Riker view it as a weapon?
The Duluth model is an incredibly influential sociological and legal framework used by law enforcement and courts to handle domestic violence. Riker attacks it as entirely pseudoscientific.
How so?
The mechanics of the Duluth model dictate that domestic violence must be viewed almost exclusively through the lens of patriarchal control. It operates on the foundational assumption that men use violence to maintain systemic dominance over women.
So it starts with the assumption the man is the oppressor.
Yes. Riker argues this framework blatantly ignores massive amounts of empirical, peer-reviewed evidence demonstrating high rates of reciprocal violence in relationships or female-perpetrated abuse.
He mentions primary aggressor laws specifically in this section.
Yeah, the Duluth model heavily influenced the implementation of primary aggressor laws. Under these policies, if police are called to a domestic dispute, officers are often trained to arrest the physically larger or more imposing party.
Which is obviously the man, almost every time.
Biologically, almost always the male. And they do this regardless of who initiated physical violence. Riker argues this is the total abandonment of Enlightenment principles of due process and empirical evidence.
They just arrest the guy because he's bigger.
The legal system substitutes objective fact-finding for an ideological narrative that dictates the man is inherently dangerous by virtue of his biology.
Now, to philosophically justify this entire legal system, this idea that masculine authority is inherently toxic and must be restrained by the state, Riker points out that the left had to construct a fake historical narrative. They had to invent the myth of the prehistoric matriarchy.
Riker takes a fascinating detour into archaeology here to dismantle a narrative popularized in the 1970s.
Yeah, tell us about Marija Gimbutas.
She was an archaeologist who heavily promoted the theory that old Europe was originally a peaceful, egalitarian, goddess-worshipping matriarchal utopia.
A feminist paradise in the Stone Age.
Basically. And according to Gimbutas, this utopia was only destroyed when violent patriarchal invaders swept in on horseback and ruined it.
Right. But Riker pushes back on this hard.
He points out that modern empirical archaeology has thoroughly humiliated this theory.
He specifically cites the archaeological dig at Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. What did the archaeologists actually pull out of the dirt there?
They certainly didn't pull out evidence of a peaceful, egalitarian utopia. When researchers excavated Çatalhöyük, which is a massive Neolithic settlement, they found brutal reality.
What kind of reality?
They uncovered a staggering number of human skulls with severe, lethal, blunt force trauma fractures.
It doesn't sound very peaceful.
Not at all. They found evidence of massive, labor-intensive defensive walls built to repel constant raiding. And they found strictly patriarchal burial practices indicating male leadership.
Wow.
Riker uses this physical evidence to state an undeniable biological law. Nature is a state of perpetual violence that demands physical protection.
And protection requires testosterone.
Exactly. Nature has always favored male leadership structures because survival in a harsh, resource-scarce world demands aggressive capability, border defense, and physical dominance.
It's just reality.
Riker argues the modern academic establishment deliberately buried these archaeological facts, admitting that patriarchy is not an oppressive conspiracy, but rather the natural hyperfunctional state of human survival completely invalidates their modern sociological narrative.
Riker is essentially arguing that trying to build a stable traditional family within the modern legal and cultural system is like sitting down at a high-stakes poker game where the dealer is legally permitted to change the rules mid-hand, look at your cards, and forcibly extract your chips just to ensure you lose.
A rigged game.
So what is his solution? How does he suggest men navigate female hypergamy and relationship dynamics in what he calls this new dark age?
He advocates for absolute, unyielding Roman pragmatism. He tells men they must stop subsidizing a broken mating market.
What does that mean in practice?
If the poker table is rigged, you don't stay seated and argue with the dealer. You stand up and refuse to play the game. He advises men to immediately withdraw their unearned validation, stop financially subsidizing bad behavior, and focus entirely inward.
Focus inward, like building themselves up.
He wants men to ruthlessly acquire resources, develop high-level competence, build physical strength, and cultivate undeniable personal authority.
Becoming the best version of yourself, basically.
Riker believes that when a man successfully builds his own sovereign intrinsic value, the marketplace eventually has to correct itself, because competence and resources are the ultimate biological attractors.
Which brings us to the crescendo of the book. Section 7, the battle plan. Riker doesn't just spend hundreds of pages diagnosing the disease. He writes a highly specific, aggressive prescription for the listener to reclaim their sovereignty and dismantle the ideological matrix.
He gives you the tools.
And the very first step in his battle plan involves weaponizing formal logic.
Yeah, Riker essentially wants his readers to transform themselves into intellectual Spartans. He demands they study and master the categorical syllogism.
For those who skipped Logic 101, what is a categorical syllogism?
It's a core form of deductive reasoning consisting of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Riker believes that if you construct a valid logical structure based on empirical data, the conclusion becomes mathematically absolute.
So it's bulletproof.
Yes. By forcing conversations into strict logical frameworks, you completely strip the modern left of their primary weapon, which is subjective emotional outrage.
He advocates for a conversational tactic he calls street epistemology, or the Columbo method.
The Columbo method is named after the TV detective who feigned ignorance to trap suspects. In practice, Riker instructs men to act genuinely curious, but to use relentless Socratic questioning to lead an ideologue into their own logical dead end.
So you don't just yell at them.
No, you don't yell at them. You ask them to clarify their premises step by step until they suddenly realize they have zero factual foundation for their beliefs.
That's a great tactic. And Riker applies this method directly to dismantle massive mainstream narratives. Let's look at how he destroys the concept of the gender wage gap using the statistical principle of omitted variable bias. What is the actual mechanism of that bias?
Well, the left frequently presents the unadjusted statistic that women make roughly 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, framing it as undeniable proof of systemic patriarchal oppression.
We've all heard that stat.
Right.
Yeah.
But Riker shows how to deploy formal logic and statistical literacy against this by exposing the omitted variable bias. This bias occurs when a statistical model leaves out key variables that influence both the cause and the effect.
So they're hiding data.
Essentially, yes. Riker instructs men to systematically reintroduce the missing data points. Things like the massive differences in overtime hours worked, the divergence in hazardous occupation choices, men overwhelmingly taking the dangerous jobs that pay risk premiums.
The deep sea welders we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, continuous years in the workforce without breaks and extreme career specialization. Once you apply cold empirical calculation and account for these variables, Riker argues the 77-cent wage gap mathematically vanishes.
It's just gone.
He proves it is a statistical deception designed to manufacture grievance, not an actual conspiracy.
He also provides a brilliant, highly effective tactical rule for engaging in any cultural debate, the no definition, no debate rule.
This is perhaps his most practical piece of advice. Modern cultural engineering relies heavily on subjective buzzwords, terms like toxic masculinity, equity, fairness, or hate speech.
They use those constantly.
Riker instructs men that the moment an opponent uses one of these nebulous terms, you immediately halt the conversation and demand a strict, empirical, operational definition.
Make them define their term.
Exactly. How is toxic being measured? What is the exact mathematical threshold for equity? If the opponent cannot provide a shared objective taxonomy, Riker says you must refuse to debate.
Because there's no point.
Right. By forcing the ideologue to provide an operational definition, their entire argument usually collapses instantly into a pile of subjective emotional demands.
But the ultimate solution Riker proposes isn't just winning arguments at dinner parties or on social media. His endgame is total structural withdrawal. He wants men to build parallel economies and sovereign corporations.
He roots this final solution deeply in the Enlightenment ideals of John Locke regarding the sanctity of private property and the fruits of one's own labor.
Okay, bringing it back to Locke.
For Riker, the ultimate revenge against a gynocentric extractive society is total financial, physical, and psychological independence.
What does that blueprint look like?
He outlines a blueprint advising men to build lean, freelance businesses, master high-value blue-collar trades that cannot be outsourced or automated, hold decentralized assets like cryptocurrency, and form private, vetted networks of highly competent men.
Building a new system.
You create a parallel economy where empirical confidence is the only acceptable metric. By executing this withdrawal, you systematically starve the bureaucratic beast. You legally minimize the tax dollars they can extract from you, you remove your fiscal labor from their corporate structures, and you withdraw all psychological validation from the state.
I see a profound philosophical tension in Riker's final advice here. Throughout the entire book, he endlessly praises the Roman pragmatism of building vast, enduring, magnificent societal systems.
Right, the aqueducts, the laws.
The aqueducts, the rigid legal codes, the global empires. He views system building as the highest expression of the masculine telos. Yet his ultimate advice to modern men is to essentially go off-grid, stop subsidizing the state, and build small, parallel structures hiding in the shadows. By abandoning the major institutions, isn't he essentially conceding defeat? Isn't he handing the keys of the main civilization over to the very ideologues he says are driving it off a cliff?
That is the most critical question to ask of Riker's framework, and he anticipates it. He addresses this through a concept he calls the historical cadence of societal collapse.
Historical cadence.
He emphatically argues that he is not conceding defeat, he is accepting mathematical reality. Riker believes the collapse of the current institutional system is no longer preventable. It is mathematically guaranteed because it has structurally decoupled from the laws of physics and biology.
So it's already over.
Just as the Bronze Age palace economies burned to the ground, and just as the Western Roman Empire shattered when it abandoned its foundational civic virtues, our modern iteration is currently in its terminal phase. You cannot patch a crumbling skyscraper if the foundation itself has turned to sand. Riker's strategy of building parallel, sovereign structures is about preserving the flame of objective reason, engineering competence, and historical truth. He believes that when the Gynocentric Mirage inevitably consumes its last surplus resources and the physical infrastructure catastrophically fails, the men who have quietly built these sovereign, highly competent networks will be the only ones equipped to survive.
They'll be the only ones left standing.
They will step out of the ashes, forge the new patriarch, and begin the brutal work of rebuilding civilization on the bedrock of objective truth.
The sheer depth and uncompromising nature of this text is staggering. We have covered an incredibly dense, mathematically focused, and biologically deterministic worldview today. Conrad Riker's book, The Gynocentric Mirage, is deeply polarizing. There is absolutely no doubt about that.
Definitely not for the faint of heart.
No. But whether you fundamentally agree with his conclusions or vehemently oppose them, you have to acknowledge that it is a meticulously constructed, highly intellectual architecture of the red-pilled manosphere's philosophy. It systematically connects the dots from ancient Aristotelian logic through the machinations of the Frankfurt School, all the way to the vulnerability circles in modern HR departments in a way you rarely hear articulated with such cold precision.
It is a profound and thorough rejection of the subjective emotional consensus. Riker demands a return to hard empirical data, historical precedent, and biological reality. And as we conclude this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on Riker's warnings about our societal infrastructure.
Let's hear it.
If a civilization entirely decouples its definition of truth from its actual physical survival mechanisms, if a society structurally decides to value emotional consensus, identity quotas, and subjective lived experience over the cold, harsh, unforgiving logic required to keep the high-voltage power grids running, the subterranean sewers clear, and the physical borders secure, at what exact moment does the physical infrastructure finally realize the philosophical foundation holding it up is gone?
That is an absolute chilling thought to end on, and a perfect encapsulation of the stakes Riker lays out. If you want to understand the deep history of our institutions and explore these concepts further for yourself, you need to engage with this source material. Please take a second right now to like and subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you these massive deep dives. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy The Gynocentric Mirage by Conrad Riker. Read the data, study the history, and analyze his frameworks for yourself. And make sure you follow him for his ongoing uncensored analysis at Conrad Riker on Substack. Thank you for joining us in the deep dive. We will see you next time.